Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our last session of the second day here at the PPX Annual Symposium 2021. I am just going to give a very brief introduction of this session, but I did want to let everyone know that the session is being recorded. In addition to that, I also wanted to mention that this session actually has or wins the award for, I believe, is the longest title of any session, which is Building Back Better means building back better for everyone. The myths that can hold us back on gender diversity and inclusion, and some solutions that can drive us forward. Remember, we're going to be monitoring the Q&A feature and the chat on the right-hand side of the window, and I'll be moderating that Q&A towards the end of the session. Now, this particular session is sponsored by the gold sponsor of the symposium, which happens to be, full transparency, the firm that I am with. I may have had some influence on that, and that is BDO. And I've asked a colleague of mine, Vivian Liu, to take over and do the introduction of the speaker. Vivian?
Thanks, Murray. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vivian Liu, and I'm a senior consultant working in risk advisory services at BDO Canada, based in Ottawa, Ontario. I have had the pleasure of working on a wide variety of evaluation engagements during my time at BDO, and I feel very fortunate that BDO continues to support PPX, where we're all able to share and learn and develop our expertise that we can then apply in our respective careers. I'm especially excited about our final speaker of the PPX Symposium this afternoon, who will be speaking about some of the common myths associated with gender diversity and inclusion, as well as some potential solutions for a way forward. Along with all the other sessions at the PPX Symposium over the last 2 days, this session is particularly relevant as we consider how topics like diversity and inclusion are affecting planning, performance, and evaluation functions today. Today's speaker is Dr. Sonya Kang, an Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She is also the Canada Research Chair in Identity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UTM and Faculty Research Fellow at the Rotman School of Management's Institute for Gender and the Economy. Dr. Kang's research leverages behavioral insights and organizational design to explore the challenges and opportunities of identity, diversity, and inclusion. Some of her most recent papers include the examination of occupational stereotypes and their effects in the workplace, as well as how self-presentation in job applications differs between genders. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sonya Kang to the stage.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction and the introduction to the introduction, and of course for organizing this very important conversation. It's really such an honor to be here and be able to share this space with all of you today. So of course we know that the theme for this year's conference is adaptation through and beyond COVID. And I think that is so important because, as you've probably been talking about throughout the conference, this pandemic has really exposed and exacerbated much of the inequality that exists in so many of the systems and structures and processes that we've really come to take for granted and come to accept over the decades. So over the past year or so, I've been working with a team of researchers and the federal government on a project called COSMO. So this is COVID snapshot monitoring. And we've collected 11 waves of data from a representative sample of around 2,000 Canadians to try to understand how people are thinking, feeling, acting in order to inform policy interventions and communications. One of the major things we've been doing is tracking people's mental health over the course of the pandemic. And I wanted to share some of that information with you today, just to sort of get us on the same starting point and normalize how many of you are probably feeling right now. If you're feeling like your well-being has taken a hit over this time, you're not alone. We have high numbers of Canadians reporting feeling all kinds of negative symptoms like having trouble sleeping, feeling anxious or nervous or on edge, feeling lonely, depressed, fatigued, burnout, occasionally, mostly, or all of the time. So this is a really stressful time for everyone. And everyone obviously includes you, all of the people you're responsible for kind of leading through this crisis, like family, friends, colleagues, team members. And if we look at all of these negative symptoms I've just been describing, they describe sort of a state of psychological threat, right? And that's the feeling that we get when what's happening around us doesn't really match up with how we want things to be, right? Which is a state where everything feels safe and secure and we can live our lives and pursue our goals peacefully in relative happiness. And when we think about people experiencing psychological threat at work, which is the main focus of my research, it kicks off a really vicious cycle. When we encounter a stressful situation, especially when it's something like a chronic psychological threat, like living through a pandemic or coping with discrimination or managing working from home while homeschooling your kids, or all of those things all at once, we experience a set of psychological, physiological, and emotional stress responses. And these are known as the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And those are the normal reactions to stress that people are probably familiar with, right? So this is things like your palms get sweaty, your vision gets blurry, your heart starts pounding, you feel kind of frozen in place. And then our emotional stress responses at the same time. And those are those negative thoughts and feelings that can lead people to kind of ruminate on what's going on. And all of those things kind of tap into our ability to pay attention. We're working on suppressing those negative emotions. We want to kind of push those things down below the surface. That depletes our cognitive resources, which over time, right, can lead to fatigue and burnout, which impacts our performance and leads back into that psychological threat. So all of the ways that we've been feeling over the course of this pandemic are set up in order to make it harder for people to work, right? And that's going to be something that we really need to correct and improve upon as we come out of the pandemic. What's really important when we're thinking about this kind of cycle of threat is that everyone can be affected at some point by psychological threat, as we all are right now during the pandemic, right? It happens for all of us. But what's important to remember is that it happens so much more for some people, especially people from traditionally marginalized groups. So whether that be women, especially women of color, women who are earning a low income or who have a disability, we have to think about all of those kind of intersectional effects as well. And really think about the cumulative effect of being trapped in this kind of cycle day after day after day. And this is kind of the focus of my work in this talk, is really thinking about how we can get out of the cycles that we've been trapped in, the myths that have kind of held us in place before the pandemic, so that as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're thinking more so about the solutions that we can apply to move past those. So what do we know about the effects of the pandemic on women? One of the ways that we've been monitoring this is at GATE, the Institute for Gender and the Economy at Rotman. We've been doing a lot of research looking into how the effects of the pandemic have really had a discrepancy in their effect, more so on women. There have been disparate health effects for women. So in Canada, for example, the majority of COVID cases and deaths have been experienced by women. Women, especially women of color, tend to be on the front lines, so they're more exposed, right? So 56% of women workers are on the front lines, right? So they're in those 5C occupations: cleaning, catering, cashiering, which is like retail, clerical work, and caring. And so all of that also leads to these disparate economic impacts. So we are now officially in a she session. We've seen so many job losses kind of concentrated for women. So 63% of those who have lost jobs or stepped back from the workplace during the pandemic have been women. And even where men have, stepped back or lost their jobs, they've regained them. So women's employment has not recovered yet, right? It hasn't returned to pre-COVID levels, whereas men's has. And this happens because there's been cuts to sectors which are traditionally dominated by women. There's lack of affordable and safe care services, and some of those aren't even open right now, right? And working from home while schools are closed is very difficult. And even now in 2021, unfortunately, a disproportionate share of childcare responsibilities and homeschooling tend to fall on women. And then, of course, there are ripple effects and things like a rise in domestic violence, rise in all kinds of different mental health stressors. And as I mentioned previously, we really need to think about this in terms of an intersectional analysis and think about how women who might identify as racialized, who are migrant workers or low income workers. Those women are those who have been most affected by these disproportionate effects. When I'm talking about intersectionality, I think it's really useful to sort of visualize what we mean by intersectionality. People often have a hard time kind of wrapping their heads around what we mean. And I really like to use this visual to do this. And this is just a wheel of power and privilege, and it helps us to understand what intersectionality really means. So if we look at this wheel, I'm just gonna get my laser pointer here. Identities that are closer to the middle of this wheel are those identities that have traditionally held power in our society, right? Control over resources, they have an easier time moving through society. Identities that are closer to the outside of this circle are those that have been traditionally marginalized in our society. They have less access to resources, less power. They tend to be the first ones who are impacted and disproportionately impacted anytime there are these negative, external shocks, something like a pandemic or a recession. These are the people who tend to be most affected. And around the edges, you see all of these different identity groups that people might be members of. So there's ability status. Closer to the middle are those who are able-bodied. As we move out, it's people who have some sort of disability. We can look at something like social class, right, where people who are higher social class are closer to the middle. And as we move out, those people become more marginalized. So people on the margins are feeling identity threat much more often. And when I think about privilege and I sort of teach about privilege, I really want people to focus on understanding that those things that you don't really think about are your sources of privilege. And I'll give you an example from my own life. So I am in this ability category. I'm someone who's able-bodied. When I go out into the world, I very rarely think about, how I'm going to access a door, or how I'm going to get into, or how I'm going to get around a building, how I'm going to get around in my own neighborhood. I just don't think about it, right? And I have that privilege of not having to think about that identity. Whereas those who have a disability, especially those who have a significant disability, are thinking about that all of the time. And this is what is so important when we're thinking about coming out of COVID, is we have to create spaces in which people's identities are protected and allowed to prosper across all of those different identities and their intersections. So this is something that's really important to think about as you're sort of planning, what are the next steps? How can we get out of this and make it better for everyone? And everyone means everyone in terms of all of those different identities that each individual holds. So I was talking a lot about psychological threat because I think it's really important to understand what people feel like when they are experiencing any kind of threat to their identity. You feel like you're, especially at work, you feel like you're out there on a tightrope. You don't have a net. You are trying to cope with all of the demands around you. You're in the midst of this pandemic with all of the sort of health and economic and ripple effects. You're completely exposed. You're completely vulnerable, right? There's nothing there to support you. And we can contrast that with a state of psychological safety, which is what we want to be creating, especially in workplace contexts. Psychological safety happens when we feel safe, we feel secure, we're protected from negative consequences. We're allowed to make mistakes. We feel seen, accepted, respected. The reason this is because in that graphic that I was just showing you, remember, those people who are in those marginalized categories are those who are having to think about those categories all the time, right? Another example in that one was sexuality. So for myself, again, I'm heterosexual, I'm married to a man, so I never think about that identity, right? When people ask me, what did you do on the weekend? I can say, oh, I did this thing with my husband, we went this place with our kids. I never think about, oh, is this gonna be weird for me to talk about my husband? Are people gonna feel uncomfortable that I'm talking about him? I don't think about it at all. Whereas I know that that's such a burden for some of my colleagues who have felt like they can't be open with those identities in the workplace. So I think that's so important to think about. We want to create that sort of psychological safety net for everyone as we come out of COVID. This year, Canada's theme for International Women's Day in March was feminist recovery. And so I think feminist recovery is exactly what we need. And not even necessarily a feminist recovery, but more so a gender-based recovery plan. and gender-based plus, right? GBA plus, which means taking into consideration all of those different intersections that exist. So what I want to do is just plug really quickly our feminist economic recovery plan that we have at GATE. Please take a look. I think people will find this to be quite useful. We authored this last year with in partnership with the YWCA. And what we do in this report is really outline that the only way forward out of this crisis is with gender, with all of those intersections at the forefront. So everything that I've been talking about so far, I think really highlights for me the distinction between diversity and inclusion, which I want to define more explicitly before we move on. So you probably hear these buzzwords all the time, diversity and inclusion, they kind of like go hand in hand. You often don't hear one without the other, but they actually mean very different things. So when we talk about diversity, what we're talking about is diversity of people, perspectives. So if we're thinking about those wheels, that's diversity in terms of having people represented from different gender groups, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different ability groups. It's all of that sort of difference that exists, variability. Inclusion, on the other hand, goes a step further from that. So inclusion is about giving people and sharing, redistributing things like power, voice, right? Having a organizational culture in which everyone is allowed to contribute. Diversity is really about getting people through the door. Inclusion is all about how we welcome people, how we make them feel once they're on the inside. So what I want us to do as we think about coming out of COVID is really not thinking that diversity, we can just add diversity, kind of like set it and forget it, and this will all kind of fix itself. We really need to think about inclusion as we bring people back into the work environment and make sure that all of the lessons that we've learned from COVID, the things that have pushed women out of the workplace, are repaired in such a way that they have that safety net there, they're included, they belong. The problem with thinking only about diversity, right, is that you can push and push and push for diversity, but if the environment is really terrible, anytime you have an external shock or, if people are unhappy, then your numbers are going to drop again. And that's what we've seen happen over the course of the pandemic. Even before the pandemic hit, women's representation in the labor market was increasing slowly, right? Slowly over decades. But that increase in gender diversity was never matched with an increase in gender inclusion, right? That's putting those safety nets into place, like having, accessible childcare, having flexible work, having access to good work with fair wages. And now, because of that, even some of the ground that had been gained on representation on the diversity side has been lost during the pandemic. So this is another useful visual that I like to use to kind of explain what I mean by this distinction between diversity and inclusion, because I think these are such important concepts. And like I said, they often get kind of combined together and people don't really know what the differences are between the two. So after kind of thinking through, what are those differences between diversity and inclusion, there's also other terms that you've probably heard spoken about in this space. One of them is inequality, which is sort of this unequal access to resources. And it's displayed in this graphic. I think it makes it really easy to understand. Again, you see this apple tree here with these two kids trying to pick the apples. Inequality means that they have unequal access. So you can see the kid on the left there, the tree is full of these apples. They're literally falling out of the tree. They're really easy to get. On the right side, there's not as many apples. The tree's kind of leaning over. And so it's not as easy to get those down. Some of the work that's been done prior to the pandemic, a lot of that work has been focused on equality. And this means kind of this distribution of tools and assistance. So we're going to give everyone some tools to help them, navigate the system. But that has traditionally worked better for those people who are closer to the middle of that power wheel than the people who are on the edges, who've been marginalized. So equality, all equality is doing is it's equally distributing tools and assistance for people to work within the system that we already have. And that's depicted by these ladders here in this image. You can see it makes it even easier for the kid on the left. It doesn't really do much for the kid on the right. What we want to do is push past the concept of equality coming out of COVID, really start thinking more about equity. Equity means we give people customized tools that identify and address inequality, right? It takes into consideration where people start on that wheel of power and privilege, right? So that if you start out in a position where you don't have great access, right? The tree is bent over, there's not as many apples on that side, you're given a bigger ladder, you're given a taller ladder, right? And you're just, that safety net is built in a different way. And what we really want to do is push even past equity to justice. And justice is all about fixing that system. So justice says, okay, we recognize that there's a problem here. We recognize that the tree, isn't growing properly. So we're going to actually buttress it up. We're going to fix it all together. So what we want to do coming out of COVID, we want to push beyond equality for equity at least, but hopefully justice. And justice means fixing the system and redistributing and sharing that access to power and those resources. And that's what, to me, inclusion really means. Inclusion is that combination of equity and justice that really makes diversity sustainable. It's that identity safety that we're looking to create for people who are going to be coming back into the workplace, who are going to be trying to engage in this post-pandemic world. So that said, I want to now just go over some myths that are holding us back and have been holding us back towards gender equality, and then share with you some solutions before we get into our discussion. And these are all from cutting edge research on issues of gender diversity and inclusion from disciplines like psychology, sociology, management, economics. And I'm going to share 3 myths and 3 solutions with you today. So the first myth that you've probably heard a lot about why women tend to be underrepresented in the workplace is that this idea of a leaky pipeline, right? And so this idea that women start out interested and engaged in certain fields, particularly we hear about this in STEM, and then they just kind of trickle out of that pipeline because they're no longer interested or they can't make it in the programs. The truth of the matter is that women are not actually, just opting out. It's not like they're just passively falling out of this pipeline. They're really getting pushed out. And this has never been clearer than during this pandemic. I mentioned that women, especially women of color, have literally been pushed out of this pipeline. So we often see when people talk about the leaky pipeline, we see figures like this that are supposed to prove that this leaky pipeline exists, right? So they'll say something like, look, it's 50-50 men and women in grade 10, but then, it starts decreasing as we move along the pipeline. And all of a sudden we get to PhD graduates where it's 20-80, 14-86 when we get to engineering faculty. It must be the case that women are kind of just falling out. So the problem is really framed very simply that women are leaving or opting out of the pipeline. So there's just less of them. That kind of thinking is not going to work post-COVID, and I'll tell you why. The reality is that women are not being just dripping out of that pipeline. If they are choosing to leave, it's because they're being pushed out. The reasons being, again, because of things like identity threat. So people often say, I don't think there's that much conflict. I don't see, men overtly discriminating against women in the workplace. Thankfully, those kinds of overt acts of discrimination have decreased over time. But we still see that women experience all kinds of subtle but repetitive acts of discrimination throughout the pipeline. So we see things with like being isolated or ignored. We see something referred to in sociology as the motherhood penalty, where women who have or do not have children incur this penalty in terms of their wages, the types of projects that they're given, the type of access that they have to promotions. We also see just the general effect of social identity threat. So all of these kind of examples that I was mentioning where women are kind of undermined, made to feel like they're not welcome. And then of course, right now we have this increased burden of caregiving responsibilities. So all of these types of pressures on women lead to this awareness of gender, right? They're having to think about gender all the time. And when you're thinking about your identity all the time, that's taking you away from the center. It's taking you away from power. It's marginalizing, right? You don't have the attention there that you need to put into your job. And that's exactly what we see in some of our research, looking at working engineers and graduate students in STEM, is that women report greater social identity threat, also report more burnout and are more likely to leave. That relationship is not there for men, right? So it's not the case that they're just leaving. It's the case that they're being pushed out of that pipeline. That's why I think that the leaky pipeline is such a bad metaphor, right? So if you literally had a leaky pipeline, you can think about this, like if you had a leaky, sink, are you going to fix the water, right? Are you going to increase the water pressure? Are you going to do something with something else with the water? No, of course not. You're going to patch the holes in the pipe, or you're going to replace the pipe, right? It has to be a structural solution. And that's what we need coming out of COVID, is that kind of structural solution. The second myth that I think is really important to address is this myth that the key to controlling bias and minimizing the effects of bias is controlling how people think. What we find, however, is that any intervention that we try that focuses on controlling biases, they tend to not be very effective, and they often backfire and have unintended consequences. I'll show you one example of this, which probably many of you are familiar with, and that's diversity training or unconscious bias training. And I'm sure many of you on this call either have heard of this or personally taken a course on diversity training. And the point of unconscious bias training is supposed to be that, telling people and teaching them about their biases is going to help them to change their behaviors. What we find, on the other hand, is that those kinds of diversity programs don't really work. They work either poorly or they backfire, so there's unintended consequences. So the three most sort of popular approaches to diversity training, which are all kind of based on, fixing how people are thinking, actually lead to decreases. That's what all those orange and red boxes refer to, decreases in representation of women, of Black men and women, Hispanic men and women, and Asian men and women. And these are the unintended consequences because you have this backlash. You can have reactance, perceptions of unfairness from majority workers who feel like, we don't want to be forced to take this diversity training. So they end up lashing out at their minority colleagues or being less willing to hire minority colleagues into the workplace, often, without really knowing that this is happening. Also, by telling everyone that they're biased, this makes them feel like it's socially normative and acceptable, right? If everyone's biased, then why do I need to change my behavior? So you might find that you're able to change people's attitudes sort of temporarily, but you're certainly not changing their behavior for the better. So another study recently compared the effects of diversity training on attitudes and behavior and found the same thing. So after people engaged in an online diversity training course, which is very similar to if you've taken a diversity training course in a corporate environment, probably very similar to what you did. And what that work found the same thing, that we see these improvements in sort of attitudes. So people will report, yeah, okay, I support women more now. I know that gender bias is a thing. I feel like going forward, I intend to be much more inclusive when it comes to gender. But on the other hand, we see no changes at all in terms of behavior. So when given the opportunity to informally mentor women, people who took that diversity training are no more likely to do so. They're no more likely to recognize women for excellence, and they're no more willing to talk to a female versus male new hire. So in terms of that idea that we're going to be able to fix this problem and even the deeper problem that's been created by COVID by just, getting people kind of excited about this issue and changing their minds, it's just not true, right? We need more of that structural solution. And then the final myth that I'll talk about before getting into the solutions is that the way to fix all of this is by fixing the women. And this is kind of related to the first point that I made about what you do with a leaky pipeline, right? You can't fix the water, you have to fix the pipe. So people will often say, we have to fix the women. We have to get them to behave more like men, right? We have to get them to, speak up for themselves more. They have to negotiate better. They have to be more assertive. In reality, what we find is that fixing the women doesn't really do a lot. And it can actually harm them, right? It can actually have unintended consequences within this system that is already kind of rigged against them either way. So this is an approach that is really popularized by Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, which probably many of you have read or at least heard about. And this really involves training women to do things like I mentioned, right? Negotiate better, talk louder, speak up more during meetings, really just about claiming space at the table. And this kind of approach is all about empowering women. And I've already seen some of this coming out of COVID about these articles that are all like, oh, we're going to train, we can help women to lose the ground that they lost during COVID. We're going to teach them all these different skills and teach them how to be more assertive. But we have found over years of research that there's actually something called a double bind for women, where they are not liked and not successful if they don't act assertively enough. But if they do act assertively, then people don't like them and they're not promoted. They have a hard time getting along in the workplace. So it's kind of like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So women really can't win when it comes to things like being assertive and how they present themselves in the workplace. And I found evidence of this in my own research as well, where women who sort of lean in and downplay their femininity on a job application are actually less likely to get hired because people don't like that. They don't like when people violate gender norms. So fixing the women by pushing them to be more assertive, to lean in, is also not the answer because of these unintended consequences. And research that has examined this lean in messaging directly confirms this idea that people who read or listen to passages from lean in are more likely to believe that women are responsible for both causing and fixing the problem of sexism, which we cannot have going forward coming out of COVID. We can no longer leave the solution and the responsibility of fixing the problem of discrimination on the people who are experiencing that discrimination. So just to summarize those myths before we move into the solutions. The first was that underrepresentation of women is a pipeline problem. Not true. Women are not just sort of trickling out of that pipeline. They're actually being pushed out of it. The key to controlling bias is controlling how people think. Again, also not true. Those kinds of interventions that are focused on changing how people think are not effective and they often backfire. They have these unintended consequences. And then finally, this idea that getting us out of gaining back the ground that we've lost during COVID is up to women. We have to fix the women, teach them how to get back in there. It's counterproductive. Again, there's going to be these unintended consequences. And we can have women do this all we want. We can try, but if we're not fixing the system at the same time, right? Remember, think back to that picture of the apple trees. If we're not engaging in this sort of restorative justice kind of activities at the same time by fixing those discrepancies, it's not going to get them very far. So now I'm going to leave us with 3 solutions and then there'll be time for your questions. So after sort of debunking those 3 common myths, these potential solutions and suggestions, I think, are based on the idea that it's nearly impossible to change an individual's behavior if you focus on the individual alone. So these solutions really think about behavioral change by thinking about how organizations can change behavior by designing for equality, right? By changing the environment, changing the structure that's around the individual so that it's designed to enable less biased thinking, less behavior, and build out that security net much better for everyone. The first solution is basically treating gender equality as an innovation challenge. What does that mean concretely? It means that organizations need to be willing to experiment and learn from failure when it comes to gender equality. So it means that they have to try out different and new solutions, be very transparent about what they're trying, follow those metrics and see what's actually changing. And I'll talk about more about that in a sec. The most promising solutions here are probably behavioral and systemic changes that focus on really creating a climate for change. So here's one example. This is from my own work. In our research, we looked at the promotion process, for example. So typically we find that women tend to be promoted at lower rates than men. When we look at promotions themselves, we see that promotions typically require people to self-nominate, right? If you want to be promoted, you have to apply. And research shows that women are less risk-seeking, they participate in competition less frequently than men. So we figured, okay, well, maybe then it's not so surprising that women are less likely to apply for promotions. So to think about this problem, we thought about what behavioral science has told us about something called defaults. And defaults are basically what happens in a situation if you do nothing. What we find is that defaults are really powerful and people tend to stick with them, right? They're really not likely to change. A really easy and great example of this is that if you have an iPhone, I have my iPhone right here. If you have an iPhone, you and I probably have the same ringtone because we probably did not change it from the default. Those defaults are sticky and people don't often move from them. Another example is retirement savings. So companies that have retirement savings programs where enrollment is the default, where you're automatically in, you can opt out, have much higher rates of enrollment than companies that have retirement savings programs where the default is that you're not in, but you have to sign up. So in the traditional way that promotions are set up, people have to opt in, and the default is to do nothing. So we wanted to see if we can, again, experiment around this problem by changing promotions from a scheme where you have to opt in and self-nominate to a frame where everyone who qualifies is automatically considered unless they opt out. We wanted to see if we could use this to increase women's participation in competition. So this is what we found in our work. I'll show you with my laser pointer. So along the x-axis, the horizontal axis here, we have two conditions. An opt-in condition, again, this is kind of the default, right? Where it's like the norm, people have to opt in to compete for promotion, and then opt out where everyone is automatically in, they can choose to opt out. And then along the y-axis or the vertical axis here, we have the percentage selected into that competitive tournament process. You can see in this condition, in the opt-in condition, we have this traditional gap, the gender gap that exists, where men were much more likely to compete than women. In the opt-in condition, or sorry, opt-out condition, on the other hand, where everyone was considered, we're able to completely eliminate that gender gap in competition. Again, we didn't do anything or say anything to the women. We don't say, you should compete more, or you'd be really great for this promotion, you should apply, right? We simply change the structure of the decision, and we're able to, in an experimental way, an innovative way, kind of remove those barriers. And I think similar things can be done coming out of COVID to help with a lot of other discrepancies that exist, right? Around things like caregiving, right? What if caregiving was also opt out? Right now we have a discrepancy between men and women who take paternal leave or parental leave, right? This doesn't have to be an opt-in. It could also be an opt-out, which we're kind of experimenting with these kind of use it or lose it programs as well. So think about that in terms of how you can apply it in your own workplaces. And then the second solution that I'll talk about is also behaviorally informed. It's about implementing behavioral guidelines and action plans. And this basically means that we have to fix the problem where people kind of have trouble going from an abstract goal to an actual behavior. So you can think of that research on online diversity training. It can make attitudes more in favor of women and minorities, but it wasn't able to change behaviors. So we really want to know, how can we bridge this disconnect? And what we can do is close something called the action intention gap. Everyone who's ever set a New Year's resolution will probably know what I'm talking about here. You can have all of these kind of big lofty goals like getting fit, walking more, saving money, but we often don't enact the behaviors that are actually needed. So what we need is to have a link between our intention and the behavior in the form of something called implementation intentions. And these are just simply, we say, whenever situation X happens, I will initiate response Y. A really great example of this that I think we're going to need so much of coming out of COVID is allyship. So allyship is basically when a member of a group that's closer to the middle of that power circle enacts a series of different behaviors to redistribute power and resources to people who are traditionally marginalized, right, at the edges of that. Both men and women, actually people of all genders, report this strong motivation to be allies. But a lot of them report that they don't know what they can do, right? So here's an example of like the typical instructions that you might receive around allyship. So we have to encourage women to pursue career-related responsibilities. We want to keep them in the loop on information, and I'll just choose that one. What does this really mean, right? What does this really mean? We need to actually help people to figure out what they need to do here. Another example of a graphic that I often see distributed for allyship, again, it's like, what does this mean? What am I actually going to do here, right? And what's funny about this is that we would never see this kind of vague instructions for any other kind of institutional or organizational goal, right? So if the CEO came out and said, look, we want to increase our profits, and then they gave us these like vague guidelines, like we have to listen to understand, you know, we have to check our assumptions, people would be like, what are you talking about? We need like concrete behavioral guidelines. And this is why coming out of COVID, especially, we need to identify for people, what are your opportunities for action? What are you watching for, right? What is the X in this scenario, right? What situations might you see where you want to help people? And then what behavior are you actually going to do? And the way that this is helpful is because you've probably all haven't had the experience, as I have, where let's say you're in a meeting or on a hiring committee, and someone says something during that meeting that's like kind of sexist or racist. And, you know, in the moment, it strikes you as something that you'd like to say something about, but then you're in your head, you're ruminating on it. All of a sudden, the moment has passed and nothing happens. And then, you know, 20 minutes later or the next day, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what I should have said. And it comes to you. Implementation intentions erase that hesitancy. They get rid of the hesitancy by telling people exactly what they should do. They establish this concrete rule. It takes away that hesitation so that when you're actually in the situation, you can actually enact what you want to do. A great example of this is something really specific. You know, if I see a woman being excluded from a work conversation, which happens a lot according to our research, what are you going to do? Very specific, right? Invite her to join in, bring her up to speed, ask for her opinion. And organizations really need to do this together as teams, right? So identify those situations that are going to call for allyship, and then talk about what's the game plan? What's actually going to work in our environment? Without those specific guidelines to inform your practice, diversity and inclusion are often kind of stuck at attitudes, and they don't actually move to action. And then the last thing I'll say is that we need to do more to create personal responsibility and organizational accountability for change. I showed you the data earlier with all the orange and red boxes showing that diversity training does not work. Here are some things that do work, right? All these blue boxes are actually increases in representation. What you need here is accountability, things like active recruitment, diversity task forces, mentoring. All of these kinds of programs get results because you've given people personal responsibility. There's organizational accountability such that you actually have to track the progress on these things. Mentorship and sponsorship are also really great examples of this. You know, mentorship, I think people now know the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, or sponsorship is more about that personal investment, you know, active connection to powerful networks, championing people. We need to really do more in terms of making sure that we have programs like that in place versus just those programs that are kind of more, you know, attitudinal or, you know, goal, you know, high level goals. And the best way to do that is to instill this personal responsibility by giving people the tools they need to succeed. Just as individuals need to be held accountable for their actions, so do organizations, because people are embedded within those structures and environments. And so those need to be held accountable as well. So for instance, Organizations have to treat diversity and inclusion as any other kind of initiative that they would set up. That means measurement. It means keeping progress on track. It means, having milestones and also publicly stating your goals and tracking progress towards that. We saw this a lot last year after the murder of George Floyd, the movement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, where all of these companies made all of these promises about what they were going to do. And those companies are going to be tracked carefully to make sure that they're accountable. And I think that's going to make those promises so much more successful than other kinds of promises that we've seen. The final thing I'll say before summing up is that when we're experimenting, we have to leave room for failure. We can't think that we need to be perfect when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because then we will not succeed. We need to leave room for failure, just like we do with any other problem, striving for progress, not perfection. At the end of the day, the most promising approach is going to be comprehensive, things that people feel like they can do, where they have good metrics to help them identify what they need to work on most, where to target their efforts. And those that are co-created with input from all stakeholders, like I have here. You really need that co-creation with people who are marginalized at the edges of that circle in order to make sure it's going to work for them. So that's all I wanted to talk about. Happy to take your questions. In terms of summing up those solutions, it's all about innovation, action plans, and personal responsibility. Why? Because inclusion is really what makes diversity sustainable. And that's why we need to push for inclusion coming out of this pandemic, really about sustaining the diversity that we want to build in our workplaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kang. Really interesting. And I noted in the chat, a few people had said that they loved that wheel, the power wheel. I would include myself in that. I found that so helpful to understand the various dimensions and how we are all in different places in that wheel. And sometimes we don't actually realize how fortunate we might be in terms of all of those dimensions. So thank you for that.
Yep.
We've got some good questions, and I'll go with the most popular ones that have been upvoted. And the first one is, how can we best measure the success of diversity and inclusion? Yeah, and you mentioned things like promotion rates and other diversity results, but especially beyond just the counts of people.
Yeah, so I would say this is, again, a question of diversity versus inclusion. So when we're talking about metrics that measure representation, those are all diversity metrics, which are super, super important in order to track things kind of early in the employee life cycle, like recruitment, selection, those kinds of things. Once we move higher in the employee life cycle, when we're talking about things like performance, learning, development, any kind of training, promotions, any of that, I think a better way to collect data on that is using qualitative data. So, you might have the skill set in your organization to collect and analyze qualitative data, or you might have to hire, get a third-party person to help you with that. But that's where you're going to get the most rich data, so that people feel like you're actually hearing them, right? They're no longer a number. When they feel like that, when they're no longer just a statistic contributing to your account, then they're going to be much more forthcoming and open about how they're actually feeling. A really great way to do this, I found in my own work, is with focus groups. Focus groups tend to be a lot more generative than interviews or just, qualitative surveys, because people really kind of bounce off of each other, and, someone might say something that triggers a thought in someone else. And those tend to be really, really rich, especially if you can run those within, like, for example, an employee resource group, right, in a safe space where they kind of report back. Those are the kinds of environments that need to be set up where people feel like they can really share what their experiences are. So I think on the diversity side, all of the metrics, the numbers, the representation, that's all great. On the inclusion side, I think you're going to get the most kind of return if you're looking more qualitatively and trying to get richer data on what needs to change and where people are feeling supported.
And so therefore their perspectives on how they're experiencing the workplace or the environment. Very interesting. Totally. Thank you. The next question that I've got is, do you have any recommendations on how to measure diversity and inclusion while respecting people's privacy around self-declaring?
Oh, yes, great question. Okay, so I've actually done a lot of work on self-declarations. This is like, I could talk about this for like a whole, like 3 hours probably. Okay, so I've done a couple different projects on this. One of them, which was really interesting, was with ESDC, Employment Skills Development Canada, and basically they were interested in this question because companies who are governed under the Employment Equity Act have to report representation of the 4 designated groups: women, visible minorities, Indigenous persons, and people with disabilities. And those companies are basically saying our representation of particularly Indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities are a lot higher than are being reported, right? And so when you think about this, it's obvious why people might not want to declare those, because those are categories, identities along which people have experienced discrimination, particularly if we are thinking about Indigenous identity. Why would an Indigenous person want to report that identity, to a government which has oppressed them? Like, it makes no sense. And so we did a lot of work trying to see how we can actually increase that declaration. And a lot of it has to do with transparency. A lot of it has to do with telling people why you're collecting the data. What in the past have you actually done with it? And if you don't have a good answer to that, then maybe you're not justified in collecting it, right? So you need to show people what you've done in the past and how that's actually improved outcomes for people from their groups. And also, we found that giving people the opportunity to self-define using whatever language they preferred is much more successful than having people like tick a box, right? So those categories can be really fraught, right? There's a lot of different terminology that's used that people might not agree with. I have this other project now with my PhD student looking at this very question about what do people prefer, right? There's always going to be a tension between organizations' need to collect this data and the need for individuals to feel respected and understood. So I think that you need the organization at the organizational level. There needs to be a lot of transparency around why this is being collected, how it's going to be used, and then also giving a lot of freedom and definition to the people that you're asking to define themselves. This is going to create more work for you, but you're going to get, because you're going to have to like code each of these responses, but you're going to get a much more accurate kind of snapshot of what's going on.
Very interesting. Okay, that's good action items, good practical action items to consider. Now, we do have a bunch more questions, but we only have time for one more, so I'll go with this one that's been highly upvoted. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with pushback from privileged groups who view equity or all of these other aspects as being detrimental to their well-being and status? In other words, how do we get past the win-lose mentality to a win-win one?
Yeah, so this is a real problem, right? This idea of kind of like a zero-sum game mindset. One of the ways that I tend to do this in kind of my training with like in executive training programs is having everyone do something called, I call it your exclusion story. And it's having everyone think about a time in their life when they were excluded based on, whatever it might be. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily an identity. A lot of people think about things that happened to them as children, actually. These are kind of the things that come to your mind right away. And we use that to start a conversation around what exclusion is like in order to show people how distracting it is, right? You all of a sudden have all these negative thoughts. You can't really concentrate on your work. And so we start the conversation from there and then kind of expand it to just have people, hear the perspectives of other people in their organization who feel like they are, not having, don't have a voice at the table, just having them be willing to listen. I think a really powerful thing to be able to do is actually to name that as a problem, right? To be able to call that out and say, like, I understand why you might feel this way. Let's talk about it. Often much more, this is much more successful if it's done, if you're talking about, let's say, a race, this is much more successfully done by, let's say, a white ally who's willing to kind of lead this conversation among people who might have these concerns, because you don't want to put let's say, again, talking about race, you don't want to put a person of color in this role of like, tell me why you are afraid of me replacing you, right? Like you want to have an ally kind of be willing to do that work for you. So I think this is another problem that can't really be solved without talking about these like difficult topics and conversations that are so hard to have, but that's where you start. And I think there's a few different ways that people can come to this. A lot of times people come to the discussion of diversity and inclusion kind of from like a business case perspective, right? They know that diverse teams are supposed to be better. Some people may come to it from a legal perspective where they're like, I just don't want to get sued. And everyone comes to it from a different place. And I think we have to be okay with that, right? We have to be okay with meeting people where they are and then helping them, come up to speed at the same time that we're holding organizations to account to change the structures and systems. And that's, I think, that is the way to kind of deal with that kind of hesitation. Definitely not the way, like I wouldn't suggest if someone's being like outright discriminatory, but just people who have this kind of hesitancy. I think that this is how we kind of bring them around.
That's great. Again, super practical advice to make all that happen. Thank you for that. We have run out of time for the questions. I apologize to the folks who do have a few others. I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Kang separately. But right now, I'd like to turn it back over to Vivian, who will thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, Sonya, for an incredibly insightful session today. To close out this year's PPX Symposium, I think for me, it was especially valuable to learn about the importance of behavioral change versus attitudinal change in the workplace. And I'm looking forward to being able to share that knowledge with my coworkers and being able to apply it in future projects and also my own organization. So like Murray said, for those of you who may have additional questions for Dr. Kang, I encourage you to reach out to her afterwards. And I will pass it back to Murray for some closing remarks for this symposium.
Great. Thank you, Vivian, and thank you, Dr. Kang. Some really interesting perspectives that we heard on diversity and inclusion and gender, both in the pandemic time and beyond, which was key. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, that wheel of power and privilege really spoke to so many of us in a very helpful way, a great visual. So in closing the symposium for today, I'm only closing the live portion of the event held over the last 2 days. Remember that this Event Mobi platform that we're all using of discussion groups, sponsors, attendees, and additional documents will remain open and active for another 6 months. So visit them ideally before you even leave today, but please come back to it again and again as the discussion unfolds. And what we'll likely do, we were talking about this earlier today, we'll likely have a discussion topic for each of our speakers as well, for each of the topics that they spoke on, which I think will be a really good way to continue this discussion. Also, the recordings of all of the live sessions, including this one, will be made available on the Event Mobi platform next week. So you can revisit any sessions that you've missed or that were your favorites, or share them with colleagues. You can even replay your favorite musical interludes if you really like. Some of them were really good, and hopefully you did dance to at least one of them. Finally, we're all in the performance business, right? And so you'll certainly understand this next ask. PPX will be sending you a survey and asking you for your thoughts about this year's symposium, first time we're doing it completely virtually, and ideas for next one. So please do take a few minutes of your time and provide your feedback in the next week. That's one of our success measures, right? Is how did we do? Tell us both quantitatively and qualitatively how you thought this symposium went. And my last point, as you probably know, PPX is a volunteer-run organization, and this entire symposium was organized by our symposium committee, which was co-chaired by Christine Minas and myself under the leadership of Katie Brown, our PPX president. So a big thank you to all of the members of the symposium committee, and also to the Willow Group, who ran all the logistics behind the scenes, this whole Event Mobi platform and everything else. If you're at all intrigued by the notion of volunteering with our organization, please contact any of our board members and we'll tell you more about how to get involved and what's really what your commitment would be. So I'm going to close the day by thanking you all so much for attending again and looking forward to our next time together, whether it's virtual or in person.